Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is James.
My name is Matt.
And in today's episode, we are looking at dangerous games. We're looking at a couple of films where people are going to virtual reality and playing a video game. But things get a little bit nasty, a little bit dangerous, and a little bit weird, don't they, Matt?
Yeah, these are some serious games people are playing. They're dangerous games they're playing. And the two films that we've got where these games get dangerous in VR are eXistenZ from 1999, directed by David Cronenberg, and Ready Player One from 2018, directed by none other than Sir Steven Spielberg of cinema himself.
Yeah, two really heavyweight directors this episode. I'm excited to get into this one.
Well then, let's boot the game up and jump right in, James.
The new millennium. This is amazing. Will bring a new experience.
You're the power source.
We'll see how natural it feels.
Where the playing field is a parallel universe.
The game's a lot more fun when it starts feeling realer than real.
No use fighting it.
I don't like it here. I think it's infected.
It's not infected. It's just excited.
I think we're still inside the game.
We have enemies in our own house. I do feel the urge to kill someone here.
Do it. It's just a game.
Okay, so David Cronenberg and eXistenZ. So we've talked about David Cronenberg when we did a guest spot on Evolution of Horror, didn't we?
Yeah, but I don't think we've had any Cronenberg on our show, have we?
No, I think this is the first time we're properly tackling him as a director and all of the crazy weirdness that comes with his kind of films. And yeah, this is a prime example of that, isn't it? eXistenZ is a weird film, but one I thoroughly enjoyed.
Oh, me too, yeah. I've only seen this film once, and I was quite young, but it left a real impression on me. It really sticks in your mind, even if, like me, you can't remember the plot whatsoever 10, 20 years later.
Yeah, this is one of those ones which I must have seen late at night on my little square TV in my room as a teenager. And I think I recorded a bit of it. And then later on, I found a proper VHS copy at a boot fair across the road from me. And I bought that for like, £1, £2. And I remember sort of the cover and just being totally intrigued by this crazy film.
Nice. This would have been a late night taping off the TV for me. And that's how I would have first experienced it. And my tiny teenage mind, I think, couldn't take in all of the plot that was going on in the film.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. But the stuff that really just sticks with you are some of the visual stuff, right? Like the game pods, the recurring gun that appears at every level of virtual reality. That's the stuff I remember clear as day.
Yeah, and that's all sort of rooted in Cronenberg's directorial style, isn't it? He's very into sort of like the idea of the body, and body horror is like his trademark, isn't it?
So the gun made of bone that Ted has to eat out of a meal, and the way the pods look like flesh and they squirm and they insert into your body. It's all very squishy, isn't it?
Yeah, squishy and sexual and all of this stuff to make it really tactile and a bit gross as well at the same time. It kind of like, it freaks you out because you're not used to seeing technology seen in this way, in like at all. Technology is always hard and cold, whereas all of the stuff in this is fleshy and gooey and tactile.
Yeah, extremely creepy, some of it. Really, there were bits that really made me wince. We've talked about this before, that I'm so much more squeamish with films than I used to be when I was younger. I don't know why, but it just seems to have come as I've aged. And when Allegra fingers Ted's bioport like unexpectedly. That really sent a shiver up my spine. It's not just like the kind of unexpected invasiveness of it, but it's the fact that it's like attached to his spine and all of that. That's what Cronenberg's so good at. And we talked about this on Patreon as well, didn't we? The difference in Brandon Cronenberg's style to his father's style. They both can make incredibly shocking scenes and films, but they approach it in a different way. And Brandon uses, in Possessor at least, some really visceral violence to do that. David Cronenberg has a much more subtle way of getting under your skin and doing things in a really creepy way that feels really icky when you see it on screen, and that's what sticks with you.
Yeah, and this sort of ickiness, and I don't know, all of it makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, but that's because you are confronted with all of these body parts, and like I said like a second ago, it's very sexualized. Like the moment you were talking about, she like lubes up her fingers before she sticks them inside him, and all of this stuff. Because even just saying that, it's so sexualized. There's orifices everywhere in this film. There's sort of like nipples on the game pods, and like the way they move is all sort of like jiggly, and it's all sort of like deliberate though, isn't it? And it's such a contrast to what we've seen throughout the series when we've been looking at VR. Like, I think the closest thing is probably Paprika, because that had a bit more of a sort of like a body element to it. Like it seemed a bit more sort of fluid in the sort of animations and things like that. But most of the time when you're shown sort of like virtual realities and technology, you get it in the form of sort of glitches or more mechanical kind of symbols in the films, whereas this is like it's all just based on the body, and that kind of sort of reinforces the idea of like how we look at reality as well. And we talked about the body mind problem previously, and sort of like this disconnect between the body and what the mind's doing, and like are they separate or are they solely, they have to be together in order to function, and all of this kind of stuff. And I think that's kind of what Cronenberg's really exploring in this.
Yeah, I thought there was definitely links to Paprika. I was seeing links all over the place to stuff that we've done. I was really reminded of Strange Days as well, more in terms of how the VR works, in terms of like taking over your entire consciousness. And there is a slightly squishy element to Strange Days as well. The squid thing that they wear on their head is nowhere near the level that Cronenberg's going for with the squishy weirdness, but it was on the same road, just not as far down. But also in the way the VR works, like I said, overtaking your consciousness. There's similarities there as well, because this is a specific subset of VR that we've been seeing. That it's not just strapping all sorts of screens around you and wearing a suit and all of that. That simulates feeling, that simulates tactile responses and images. It takes over your mind's eye and replaces what you're experiencing. So you get sight, sound, taste, everything, all just taken over.
Yeah, you're properly plugged into this virtual reality, and the fact that it is through your spine, through a kind of like umbilical cord in these meta flesh game pods, that gives it that other sense of sort of like realism. But that's sort of like the ironic thing about this film, because it is layered in lots of different realities, and sort of this first introduction into the world where we're shown all of these game pods and sort of like the bone guns and all of this stuff, later on, like you find out this isn't sort of the end of the reality, like this is part of another simulation. And all of this is kind of like, you kind of get moments throughout the film where you do doubt this reality that Cronenberg is showing you, like the way that the different buildings are labeled. So you've got like the gas station is the gas station, the motel is the motel, the ski club resort is the ski club. All of these buildings, which like reminded me of Dark City, because that did the same thing, didn't it? So all of the buildings you're shown in that, like the Barbers is called the Barbers. It adds that surrealness to it and sort of simplifies, it sort of dumbs down the reality a bit.
Yeah, there's lots of little things there that make you wonder about the nature of reality. So similarities again. Dark City's there. You were talking about the layers upon layers. That's like Inception. There's this whole element of like playing a role when you go into the VR. I'm trying to think if we've seen that before. I mean, Dark City has an element of that because the sleeping people of the Dark City are like recast into a new role every night or whenever they're tuned. Allegra makes reference to it when we're supposedly in the real world, when she says, we have to stop here to have an intimate moment together. It's like she's addressing the need for a game urge before the concept of game urges are introduced into the film itself.
Yeah, the sort of the game nature of it as well is so integral to it. The fact they are in a video game, and you've got to take into account the fact that this came out in 1999 as well, the same time as The Matrix. So The Matrix had that sort of like gaming element as well, sort of all these crazy things that they can do in these virtual realms, like the kung fu and whatnot. And with this, the game sort of like, it's still rooted in a kind of like realism because they don't have these godlike powers. They are playing roles as characters in the game. They can't sort of like fly around and do this and that. They are playing a role, and that role is sort of like so integral to their sense of identity in it as well, isn't it? So it's constantly changing and evolving throughout, isn't it?
Yeah, and it can interrupt your own personality or what you might think is your own personality. This film actually leaves a lot of that as an open question, I think, by the end of it, because the like you said, the reality that we're expected to believe is the real world initially is not the uppermost layer of reality. So everything we're told about the characters' role playing and their actual personalities is kind of, well, we don't have definite answers on how much they're acting and how much they're able to control their characters, because everything we're told about that is rules within the VR world and might not apply to reality.
Yeah, because it's interesting that they only talk about game urges and things like that, and like how the psychosis element comes into play and all of this feeling of being disembodied when they go into, like, from seemingly, when you watch the film, the first layer of virtual reality, when they go into the eXistenZ game. And when they do that, you suddenly sort of like, then they open up all these ideas of like playing the role, and they've got NPCs in there as well, which we've seen previously when we looked at Jumanji. When we looked at that, they had those sort of like non-playable characters which just play out roles and just have certain dialogue. What did you think about the way that they sort of made it clear that that was kind of like a game as much as they could? It was
done in quite a fun way, I thought, considering how the rest of eXistenZ is. There's a real sense of dread throughout the film, and gross things are happening all the time. But then when they first go into that level and they introduce that idea of NPCs and Allegra's telling Ted how to like get into character and stay in character, that was actually quite a weirdly fun part of the movie. And I think Ted starts to flip back into feeling creeped out almost immediately after that, but he's also getting into it a little bit. So you're kind of, there is more of a sense of fun at that moment, which goes appropriately with the idea that they're playing a game, that they're getting into it and actually starting to have fun with it a little bit. But then that sense of psychosis creeps back in, and Ted gets uncomfortable again, and any sense of fun kind of fades away, I think, a little bit. It does come back at times, but that was what I got from it.
Yeah. And I think the fact that when they first go into the layer of like virtual reality that they go into, when they're in eXistenZ, the fact that they're in like this store, which is kind of a cross between like a computer game shop and a sex shop, that's kind of what I had in my head, because like they're picking all these different like games they could try, but also like one of the things they pick up is this sort of this mini game pod, which looks a bit sexual again, just because of the way the game pods look. And I saw those kind of comparisons Did you sort of get that vibe?
Yeah, and it was accompanied with a sense of general seediness and come into the back room and I'll show you the real merchandise. Yeah, there was definitely like seedy sex shop vibes to it underneath the kind of video game store that it was supposed to be.
The world of games is in a kind of a trance. People are programmed to accept so little, but the possibilities are so great. eXistenZ is not just a game. It's an entirely new game system. And, it involves a whole lot of new toys, which you're going to be the first to try out.
And that's like our hub world, right? In the game of eXistenZ. That's kind of the overworld, and then the product you buy in there is the level that you'll go into now. That's what you're going to actually do in the game. Is that was kind of the sense of that. But we go into the trout farm. It's actually the Chinese restaurant is the level, but we get there through the trout farm. And it goes straight back into just pure Cronenberg slicing biological things up and blood going everywhere and dissections. It just gets really gross again almost immediately.
Yeah, and the fact that these consoles they're using are made from like amphibians and all this kind of stuff. The fact that they are fleshy and like you said, he's dissecting these trout and he automatically knows which bits to get to make these machines that they're making in this factory. All of this just gives it that other sort of like element, because this is how you would make a games console, but you do it with like electronics and plastics and things like that. But with this, the fact that it's like a living organism almost made from
completely
all these,
living, yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of got that Frankenstein element to it as well. They've got dead bits of old amphibian together, and by using that, you can create this thing that you stick into your spine. And yeah, it's just such a mad idea, but it works so effectively in creating this weird sort of disconnect between the real and the virtual.
And it's not just Frankenstein amphibian DNA all sliced and diced and strapped together. They're mutant amphibians as well. He's really driving home the disgusting nature of it, I think, is what he's going for. That it is a mutant aberration that is deliberately bred, and the mutation is continued and advanced for the purposes of slicing it all up and making this disgusting thing that plugs into your spine. I think he's really, really like trying to drive home at all angles that the pods are supposed to be disgusting and make you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, they're very, very disgusting.
But then Allegra's playing this character that is like emotionally attached to these disgusting weird pods and somewhat sexually attached to them as well. The way she sort of cuddles with it and nuzzles it, you know, it's a very like, it's between a motherly relationship she's got with the pod and a sexual relationship. It's all very strange and creepy.
Yeah, and she takes a very dominant role in the film as well. Like, she's the one inserting things into Ted, and she is sort of like trying to force him almost into playing eXistenZ. So she is taking the sort of the control. She's taking the lead in everything. And talking about sort of like her connection to the game pods and almost the amphibians as well. Like you see these weird mutant amphibians in the first layer of reality as well, don't you? You see them at the gas station. And so you've got them there, and you see the bone gun there as well. So once you see them again in the game, you can't be sure whether they're sort of like their bleeds from the real world into this eXistenZ world, or if they're from like, if they're both fake. They kind of, it's sort of all that doubt about what's real and what's not.
Well, I felt that kind of worked as I guess I'd describe it as like a peak and a trough movement of those concepts. Like the gun comes into the Chinese restaurant level of VR in a natural, believable way, which is that we understand that we're in a VR and we've gone deeper into VR, and then Ted constructs one in that deep VR world, and that makes sense. There's a logical sort of progression. But then as we come back out of the layers on the other side, elements of the lower realities are bleeding through into the upper realities. And that's when it stops making sense and it becomes very jarring. So when the gun is coming back up, and the gun moves about through reality by a dog carrying it, characters just say, my dog brought this to me, or his dog brought it to me, which I thought was very funny, to be honest, because it's literally a shaggy dog.
Yeah.
And that shaggy dog becomes pivotal in the end. But it's carrying this Chekhov's gun basically throughout the layers of reality. It's a combination of those two tropes, like Chekhov's gun and shaggy dog story. But that method of transport up the realities I thought was really interesting on the other side, going the other way up, where everything's just bleeding through and not really making any sense.
Yeah, and like I love that moment when Ted is constructing the gun out of the special from the Chinese restaurant. It kind of gives an explanation as to what the gun is, because when you first see it in the first part of the film, it's very foreign. It's using teeth as bullets, all of this stuff like attached to it. The fact you get a kind of explanation for it in this virtual world, I thought that was really good and interesting.
Yeah, it's like that upwards direction of reality bleed through has already happened at the start of the film because the bone gun is there. But in that first half of the film, more of an effort is made to explain that weirdness. Like you said, there is an explanation given. It's to evade like metal detectors, which makes a sort of sense, but shooting teeth is never really going to make sense. It's just strange. But it's like that reality bleeding through the layers has already happened and made things weird at the start. It's just, they try and explain it a bit.
Michael, what are you doing?
I don't know. I find this disgusting, but I can't help myself.
Good.
Good. You think this is good?
Yeah, it's a genuine game urge. Something your game character was born to do. Don't fight it.
I'm fighting it. But it isn't doing me any good.
And the way they sort of go into these different layers as well is quite interesting, because Ted talks about the fact it feels like seamless. And then Allegra says like you can get different games where it's more of a slow dissolve or like a straight cut. And it talks in kind of almost filmic terms as to how they could get to this next bit of the film and how it would work when you're going into this virtual reality.
Yeah, there's lots of film terms. So that's match cut editing that you were talking about when we looked at Paprika, isn't it? That Ted gets plugged in, then he just starts looking around the room, and then the next cut that we see is closer to his point of view, but it's now a fully populated video game store. But there's loads of like film references and stuff. The idea of playing a character, they really like go all out on that concept in the very end, where we see all of the characters sitting around, everyone that's been in every layer of reality now sitting around and commenting on their own performance, like an involuntary performance that they just gave, and like critiquing themselves and their character. Like Christopher Eccleston thinks his character's boring. Ian Holm was disappointed with his own accent. That was like just an incredible scene that I'd somehow forgotten from the first time I saw the film.
Yeah, because it's got like an incredible supporting cast as well, hasn't it? Which we haven't really mentioned, like William Dafoe as well as Gas in the gas station. All of these like great actors, which are just sort of like almost sidelined by the characters. But of course you find out it's all deliberate because they are playing this game, Transcendence, which is the actual game that they're playing, which you find out later on in the film to add another sort of like element of weirdness and craziness to it. And by doing that, they're sort of like they're building upon this like the performance element, like you said, like they're all critiquing their performances, and their characters are the ones which like stay the same in the sort of linear kind of story of the film. But Ted and Allegra, like they kind of like change, don't they? Like there's a few plot moments where their characters change or reveal things about themselves. So like Allegra is the game creator. She's the demoness Allegra Geller. She is sort of like the dominant one. And then when they go into the first layer of virtual reality, Ted is supposed to take the lead on certain conversations and things like that. And then they build up this romantic relationship, which isn't there before when they're in the other world. It's like Ted is just a security guy. He's never had a implant. And then suddenly he's this other kind of guy. And then later on, it turns out that Ted is part of the resistance. All of this kind of stuff is changing their character and changing their identities in the film.
And it's sort of implied that in the level of reality that the film ends at least, Ted and Allegra are like the best at playing the game. They're the best gamers. And I think there's like a connection there between the fact that they're able to have consistency in their characters and their characters like appear in the plot the most. Like, who's the guy who's disappointed that he dies so early? Is it Gas, Willem Dafoe, or is it it might be one of the other characters? But someone's disappointed that they're out of the plot so early. I think it's the implication is they're not so good at gaming, so you don't last as long in the game as it would be in any video game. You're knocked out early. So Allegra and Ted are kind of the best, and Allegra specifically is the best because she wins, but she also throughout the narrative is able to kind of keep her personality, the personality of the character, roughly intact. She's always the game designer, Allegra Geller, pursued by villains at every level trying to kill her. Ted's good. He stays until the end, but he's got this disjointed personality that's kind of all over the place and losing control of his character and then turning into a different character at the end. He's not as good as Allegra, who is completely consistent. That's what I kind of took from that.
But then that could be partly due to the characters that they are, because they're not... Because obviously Jennifer Jason Leigh is Allegra Geller and she's like a main character. She is the creator. Whereas Jude Law is just like a sideline security guard. Yet, like you said, because of the way he plays him, he's able to get further in the game.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is Allegra Geller, the game designer, wouldn't have been the main character of the game they were playing if Allegra, the player, was not so good at the game. You know, if Gas was a better gamer, the narrative would shift and the mechanic would have become a bigger character at all levels of the story than Allegra was. That was my kind of understanding of how the game of Transcendence worked, but we get very little time to sort of mull over that. You've just got to like take what you take, I guess, at the end of it.
Yeah, it goes at a real pace, doesn't it? Because the film's only an hour and 37, almost your perfect time there, Matt.
It's got very long opening credits as well. So.
Yeah, I forgot how long the opening credits were. It took a while, probably about 7 minutes of opening credits before it gets in. But also this idea of the game creator as like either a god or a devil is quite interesting, because the film really throws doubt on the creator of the games and how sort of this idea of virtual reality could affect people for the worse or the better. Like Gas says how it's changed his life. Like he's become a god in one of the games. I think the game he plays is like God or something like that, or be a god. And
Art God.
Art God. So it's like he's had like thou art God. I think it's alluding to something like that, isn't it?
So the game's called Art God, and then there's like he quotes like a line from it, which is something like "You, the player, thou art God," something like that. And yeah, it's just an opportunity for Willem Dafoe to be crazy and intimidating as Willem Dafoe does so perfectly all the time, because he just reflects on how funny that is. But you know, whenever Willem Dafoe is finding something funny in a film, it makes the audience and the other characters feel incredibly ill at ease, I would say.
But yeah, because like he's played a game where he's been God, and that's had an effect on his personality, hasn't it? Like he's experienced that. So what kind of like impact does that have on him and his daily life? Because he seems like his character in the game is supposed to be happy being a mechanic because he's also being a god. So all of this kind of like impact that virtual reality is having on people, but then the realists, the people which are combating that, see all of these things and see that they're making these game pods from like flesh and things like that, and all of like the negative things that are attached to this kind of like disconnect from reality. That's quite a nice sort of juxtaposition to have in there. And I don't know if we've seen that kind of like anti-virtual reality in this kind of way before.
Yeah, the people who are concerned about the effects that it's having on people's mental state, basically. And rightly so, if we take at face value that the final level we see is the real world, it's left Ted and Allegra incredibly messed up in the head. But at the same time, they're not, if that is the real world, they're not part of a wider movement, I don't think. They are just two people who have strong opinions and maybe want there to be a movement like what we see in the virtual reality, the realist movement. But I think they're acting alone. They're just a couple of crazies with a gun strapped to a dog.
Yeah. And all of their like it sort of transpires that all of their thoughts about this and being like realists and anti-virtual reality, that's all bled into the game, because the game creator in this sort of like extra layer of reality we're shown at the end of the film, he's saying when they were playing the game, it was very sort of anti-game. And he was worried about that fact because that must have come from one of the gamers. So the fact that these virtual reality games are having this like subconscious bleed into how the game plays out, I thought that was another interesting thing, because it's kind of like more rooted in this kind of virtual reality dream idea and how the subconscious plays into all of that kind of stuff.
Well, that's partly why I think Allegra is the best player, because we have to just have some faith that some of the things we're told about eXistenZ are true about transcendence, but we don't know that for a fact. But the fact that your thoughts and personality can shape the game, and vice versa, the game has its own personality. But yeah, like that, you have to take that as read, and that Allegra's personal feelings and Ted's personal feelings about games in general and their sort of dislike of it has shaped the VR world, and that's what both eXistenZ and transcendence technology allows you to do in the game.
So it's almost like the more dominant your personality is, or it sort of helps you out in the game.
I think so. I think that's implied, but of course we just, we don't know that's true, do we?
Yeah, and I think this is the thing. I don't think Cronenberg's as interested in sort of making those kind of like explorations. His real thing is the sort of body-mind thing. And I think what he's saying is the body is kind of like our medium into reality. That's how we experience reality. It's all sort of like, it's fleshy and real and tactile. And that's how this virtual reality works. Everything is like that. And then when they come out of that in the final scene, the way the sort of like the virtual reality tech looks, it looks more like you would expect in any other virtual reality film. It's like you've got like a thing on your hand, and you've got like a thing on your head, and it's like plasticky almost. So it gives it that sense of like, this is what virtual reality is like in any other sci-fi film. And then also the fact that they all pull out their phones and things like that afterwards, and they didn't really have that before, because it's kind of like, even though this virtual reality world in eXistenZ is supposed to be like the future and this weird crazy tech, everything is quite sort of almost a bit sort of 50s-ish, because they're going to like an old gas station, they're in an old church, no one has a phone, they travel in a car, and then when they're traveling in the car, they've got sort of like the rear projection, haven't they, like they do in those old school films. It's kind of got that sort of old-timey feel to it still.
And they're also moving around just kind of place to place in a way that Inception would characterize as, dreamlike. But also they talk about, they say they're in the countryside early in the film, and it sounds very normal as you would refer to the countryside. But then when Gas says it later, I don't know, I really picked up on, he says it's all over the countryside, and just something about the way he used the term the countryside, like you were saying before about how the gas station is just called like gas station. he almost used the countryside as like a proper noun. Like the name of this place is the countryside, and there is a network of people living in the countryside. Yeah, it felt like it was this vague, undefined place. And Allegra's even commenting on it when they're in the trout farm. I think she's talking about. I think Ted says something like, "Oh, it's like a half-formed world," and she's like, "Yeah, it sounds like my game." And it's like, and I was like, "Oh, that sounds like your top level at the moment. That sounds like reality. Actually, is what sounds like your game, Allegra."
I'm feeling a little disconnected from my real life. Kind of losing touch with the texture of it. You know what I mean? I mean, I actually think there's an element of psychosis involved here.
Yes. This is a great sign. It means your nervous system is fully engaging with the game architecture.
eXistenZ is paused!
So before we get to the end scene, we've already talked about it quite a lot. We talked about how reality's kind of like breaking down a little bit and stuff is bleeding through the layers and coming up. There is this total breakdown of what we are told is reality when Callum Keith Rennie, we haven't even mentioned Callum Keith Rennie.
Oh, I knew you would love the Callum Keith Rennies in this one.
Back on the pod and brilliant as always. Yeah, he could just burst through the window. He's dressed like a little boy who's pretending to be a soldier. He's not even in like fatigues. He's just got like a green t-shirt
and a beret.
And yeah. And he's a member of the resistance, and there's just like vague gunfire and explosions everywhere. It felt like reality was completely breaking down as the game was approaching its end game.
Yeah, and it kind of becomes like an action game at that point, doesn't it? Because like you said, there's explosions, things on fire in the background, people running around, machine guns. It's all very chaotic. And that's when you get this extra twist that Ted says, "Oh, actually, I'm part of the resistance. Like, I was going to kill you, Allegra." All of this kind of stuff. And the fact that Vinegar is like a double agent and he's actually working for this other company. And that is mirroring all of the weird sort of double agent stuff that was happening when they were playing eXistenZ. And it just goes completely off the rails, doesn't it? Like everything is like, you're doubting everything. Everyone's telling a lie and everything's just crazy and action-packed.
Everyone's a spy or a double agent. None of it makes sense, but everything's accelerating. Like if you had a second to stop and think about what's going on, it was like, hold on, those characters weren't on the same VR level. Why are they concerned about each other's position in relation to cortical dynamics or whatever the company's called? But you've got no time to deal with that. And it felt like it was deliberately like accelerating the plot of the game to its climax. And also, I mean, that the same could be said about making a film, like throwing in increasing pace and action and violence and explosions forces things to a narrative climax, and that's true of a game and a film, and that's basically what eXistenZ/Transcendence is doing to the characters.
Yeah, and it ends on that sort of like that crazy eerie note as well when Allegra presses the button and blows out Ted's spine before she goes into the real world, and she does this like manic like, did I win? And you're kind of like, at that point you're doubting what's going on, but then you see the VR stuff on her, and then it goes into this extra sort of like epilogue bit where it explains a bit more. But it's just, all of it is just very off kilter, and it kind of makes you feel a bit uneasy the whole time because you never know what twist or turn is going to happen next.
Yeah. So do you have any distinct feelings about whether the final scene is in the real world or not?
I think it is, because it seems more grounded in reality. And the fact that you've got like, I think the very last line is this real? Are we still in the game?
Yeah.
And that's said by the guy who was in the Chinese restaurant. So it's kind of like, it's showing you that even after you've played this game, you will still doubt your reality. You're gonna doubt if this is real or not. But everything else just sort of like alludes to the fact that this is supposed to be the real world, I feel.
I got that feeling as well very strongly. There is that distinct message of like a lingering question over your reality, as we've seen in lots of films. But yeah, I was same as you. There was a lot of stuff there that it felt very real. The main thing for me was how the characters, or how the players are all like dissecting their characters, and specifically the accents they are speaking in, which I actually thought, like on reflection, was a really very bold thing for Cronenberg to do as a filmmaker, which is to basically have your actors talk in bad accents through most of your film, which is very jarring. Like Christopher Eccleston sounds terrible. And when the film started, I wrote it off as, I didn't know Christopher Eccleston can't do an American accent, but I guess he can't do an American accent. End of thought. But then when
like
you hear
The Leftovers, he does an amazing American accent in that.
Exactly. I just forgotten about that, and I didn't have time to sort of think, have I seen him do a good American? Like he obviously can. I'm not trying to do him down. He's a great actor, but he's doing a terrible American accent at the start of the film. And then he's talking in his natural. He's Mancunian, I think, isn't he? That I thought was an incredibly bold choice to basically tell your actors to do a stupid accent, get Ian Holm to do a terrible Russian accent, so that you can have him dissect that and comment on it at the end of the film in his natural voice.
Yeah,
that's what made it feel like reality to me.
Yeah, it's such a lovely touch, isn't it? Because you're right, I didn't really think about that when I was watching it, because when you're watching a film, you kind of like, you know that certain actors don't speak in that accent, so you just bypass it. You just get into the world of the film. But the fact that they were so bad and then they sort of do that reveal at the end, that's beautiful filmmaking.
Yeah, I think so. And even very subtle things like this is a Canadian film. Cronenberg is a Canadian director. Well, I think it's a joint production, but it would have been shown in Canada primarily. I think Jude Law is specifically doing a Canadian accent, because I really picked up on him saying a boat instead of about, and sorry instead of sorry. And I thought that's not, Jude Law can do an American accent, and I think he wouldn't naturally slip into a boat. I think he's been told to say a boat. So I was really picking up on very minute little accent things that they were doing. And then again, Jude Law is just speaking with his normal English accent at the end of the film. I thought that was all very clever stuff, because it's jarring if you're paying attention to it and if you care about these actors' normal abilities to do accents, and it jars you enough to just have that thought, which is a little seed of doubt that really pays off at the end of the film. It's weird that was like my favourite thing about the film, basically, is what I'm saying. The stuff like Christopher Eccleston did a bad accent, but it has a payoff. I found that so satisfying.
Yeah, but again, these are filmic things which add to that virtual reality element again, because like it's changing the nature of what you're seeing, and then you're sort of like doubting what's real and what's not. Or like you said, I think the performative element of this is really important, and sort of like that all comes into the storytelling and all the sort of the plot points and all of these things you were talking about, like Chekhov's gun, the Shaggy Dog story. These are things that Cronenberg knows about as a filmmaker, but to put them in this in such a way to play off of the virtual reality and be a bit more blatant with some of the ways that he's using them, it's just like he's having fun with it as well.
If you make sure there's some mutated amphibian nervous systems in the rice. My accent in the game was so thick I could hardly understand myself.
Yeah, exactly. I think, frankly, this is a master filmmaker just making a film with absolute confidence in his abilities. And you have to put a lot of trust in him to go along for the ride. But the payoff is completely worth it. I loved it.
And this is all stuff which I never got as a teenager watching this. I was just like, it's gooey and gross and quite scary, so I like it. But now I can look at it and be like, right, there's all this other stuff going on that is actually quite deep and works on that kind of level.
Yeah, absolutely. So shall we go from one master filmmaker at the height of his craft to another master filmmaker celebrating his own craft, Steven Spielberg's Ready Player One?
Sounds like a plan.
My name's Wade Watts. My dad picked that name because it sounded like a superhero's alter ego, like Peter Parker or Bruce Banner. But he died when I was a kid. My mom too. And I ended up here. Sitting here in my tiny corner of nowhere. There's nowhere left to go. Nowhere. Except the oasis. whole virtual universe. People come to the Oasis for all the things they can do. But they stay because of all the things they can be.
Can you feel this?
Yeah. It's the only place that feels like I mean anything.
So we're talking about Steven Spielberg once again on the podcast. We have covered a couple of Steven Spielberg films. We talked about Minority Report and we talked about AI previously. But I feel like we still haven't really got into his collection because he's got such a legacy around him, hasn't he?
Yeah, there's a few massive Spielberg sci-fi films that, rest assured listeners, we will be covering in the future of this podcast. They're sitting on a shared Google Doc at the moment. But he's popped up in our AI series, he's popped up in our time travel series. You can't go far in sci-fi without encountering Mr. Spielberg, can you?
Yeah, and in film in general, because I think a lot of people, when they think about film and they think about directors, Steven Spielberg is kind of the go-to. He was such a breakout director, and I think he's kind of like God level when it comes to directors, isn't he? Because everybody knows his work, and everybody, when they think of directors, they think of him.
Yeah, he's like a combination of like competency and prolificness. Like he's got so many more films than James Cameron, Martin Scorsese, Coppola. You know, he's been pumping them out over the years, and they're not all like amazing films, but he makes his films very well. They are engaging and entertaining, family-friendly, action-oriented adventure films for the most part. And he really can make a film in that mould seemingly quite effortlessly.
Yeah, he's got a love for the craft, hasn't he? And sort of all of the things that go into making a film. He's been doing it for years. That's why he's become so competent as well now. But even his early work, it was all sort of showing these elements of how to tell a good story and how to engage with your audiences. And I think it's no coincidence that with this film, Ready Player One, we're looking at the idea of a creator having his own world, and sort of it's got all of these pop references and everything. And I think Spielberg really kind of leans into that side of the story as well. And the idea of this guy, James Halliday, who is this creator of this legacy.
Yeah, I'll come right out and say that I wasn't a big fan of the pop culture side of what you're describing there. The sort of endless references to old movies and whatever in this film. But I definitely thought that, you know, if anyone has a right to make this into a movie, Steven Spielberg's name would be at the top of that list, wouldn't he? He's at the heart of pop culture for the last, I don't know, 50, 60 years. I don't know how long he's been working. But a good chunk of the last century the pop culture has been steered by Steven Spielberg in various ways. So I feel like he's got a right to some extent to be the person to make the ultimate pop culture reference movie.
Yeah, and this is that movie, isn't it? It is packed with pop culture and fandom and all this kind of references. It's just littered with it. And the fact that you didn't enjoy that much in the film, I guess that kind of like put quite a negative spin on the film, because it's so ingrained into it. And that's kind of like, I did enjoy all of that. Like I enjoyed seeing all the Easter eggs within Easter eggs, all of the little characters which you recognize, like there's a Battletoad, or like look over there's this character from this and whatnot, and that's a reference to Buckaroo Banzai and all this kind of stuff. It's all in there. Yeah,
just absolutely exhausted by all of that by the end of the film. I'll be honest with you, I just didn't care. I think, I'm sure we've talked about this on the podcast before, that like I'm not above nostalgia. I'm not trying to say that nostalgia is bad, and it's certainly, like, as any sci-fi fan would be, I'm susceptible to having that part of my brain tickled by seeing a reference that I get on screen. I completely understand that, but this film is just like relentless with it. But then I'm a massive hypocrite because Serenity shows up towards the end of the film, and I was like, cool, Serenity. And there's a Dune reference, and I'm gonna love a Dune reference. So I know I'm a massive hypocrite for being annoyed by the exact things that then made me happy.
Yeah, but it is like the crux of the film, isn't it? All of this kind of this knowledge of nostalgia and fandom and pop culture. That's kind of what leads our main protagonist, Parzival Wade, on this quest. But we should talk about the sort of the Oasis and how that works, because all of these pop culture references come in through the VR tech and this virtual reality world that's been created. So how does that work in the film, first off?
Yeah, we've got this shared VR video game called The Oasis, which is seemingly enjoyed and experienced by like most of the people in the world. That wasn't, I don't know if that was completely spelled out, but we get like a montage of the main character in the real world, and the background is full of just people going about their daily lives using Oasis gear. So I got the sense that it was like a VR game that basically everyone in the world is playing, because it's a dystopian world that sucks, and people have given up on trying to make the world better because they can just easily and affordably disappear into a nice VR world.
Yeah, because the world is supposed to be quite depressing as well, isn't it? And they all, Wade lives in this place called the Stacks, where it's just loads of mobile homes stacked on top of each other, and everyone seems sort of like quite poor, but they're all sort of living these fantasy lives through this VR tech. And he talks about in the sort of like beginning exposition, he mentions that everybody's trying to get money for their virtual avatars so they can sort of like spend that in that virtual world. They're more concerned about their coin in the Oasis than their actual coin in the real world. And they do a bit in the beginning where his aunt's current partner has spent all of the rent money on loads of like bonus items on this game, and just sort of that as a concept is quite interesting, because there are people which do that. They spend loads of money trying to sort of like build up their avatars on whatever, on like League of Legends or something like that. They spend all of this time and effort in the game, and it's just become a whole different like level in this film.
It's like a microtransactions world gone mad or gone global.
Yeah, everyone's spending money a lot.
How realistic or believable did you think the basic premise of Ready Player One is?
I think I found it fairly believable, actually, just because like you don't know what that kind of like virtual reality would impact society. And if the world is so shitty that your only escape is to be this other person in this like bright world where your imagination can just run wild. You can create whatever you want to create. You can look like that pop culture reference. You can create a suit based on that. You can get all of these special items. It's just boundless.
Yeah, I thought the combination of like an exponential increase in environmental and societal dystopia combined with an exponential increase in VR technology, I found that quite a believable scenario. I guess what I didn't find believable was the world of Oasis and the way that pop culture had just taken over the entire planet's culture. Just because there's a certain type of monolithic pop culture that Ready Player One is fixated on. The kind of nerdy sci-fi fantasy general umbrella genre having taken over the entire planet. I just don't think that... I think we already don't live in that monolithic culture anymore. And the internet has allowed this proliferation of niche cultures to spread like wildfire. I just don't believe that the entire world could become obsessed with, Back to the Future, dare I say it, in another 20 years' time,
Yeah, I think you're right. As much as people sort of like know and love all of these things, there are equally people which just have no interest in anything like that or anything sort of fantasy sci-fi based at all. So a world like this for them, but I mean, they do show characters like that. I mean, Sorrento, the main villain of the piece, he is someone who doesn't believe in any of that. He's just obsessed with the money aspect of things and the business model.
Yeah. Maybe it would have been interesting to see a few more characters who just had no interest in Oasis, and maybe it's just because we're seeing everything through the eyes of Wade and his friends, and they're obviously really bought into the Halliday cult of the Oasis.
Yeah, it is a little bit culty, isn't it, with all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Cult in the kind of cult pop culture sense, but also they act like a literal cult.
Yeah, works both ways.
You can do anything. Go anywhere. Like the vacation planet. Surf a 50-foot monster wave in Hawaii. You can ski down the pyramids. You can climb Mount Everest with Batman.
So it took a long time for this book, the book Ready Player One, to be adapted into the film. And the fact that Ernest Cline was working with Steven Spielberg on this, that must have been a dream come true for him. It took 7 years for it to be adapted properly. And when you look at other sort of popular books sort of at this level, like things like Hunger Games, Maze Runner, all of those books were adapted in about 3 or 4 years, I think.
Right.
So those extra years that were spent trying to make this, because this, on the surface, is a book that couldn't really be put to film, because apparently it's dense in all of its references, and just creating this virtual world and making it believable is quite a task in itself. But it's also got sort of comparisons with Willy Wonka as well, and this is something that Ernest Cline has mentioned. He's talked about how his initial idea was, what if Willy Wonka was a game designer and there was a kind of like a golden ticket to win the factory, but in the world of this game? So what did you think about that? Because that's the main plot of the film, isn't it? This kind of golden ticket idea.
Yeah, and the illusion becomes much clearer at the end when Wade turns it down. It was all a test, and Halliday wanted, a good kid to take over the keys to the kingdom, which is, I think, is what happens at the end of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as well, from what I remember.
It's the gobstopper moment when Charlie almost takes the gobstopper to give to the rival company. Isn't it Slug or something like that? The name of the guy who's something like that, but yeah. That
same sort of, the sense of someone who really is passionate about the project, inheriting the project. That was the moment where the kind of comparisons to Willy Wonka clicked in for me. But yeah, it's certainly there from the beginning, isn't it? He's eccentric, he's aloof, he's mysterious and withdrawn from society. Creates a massive competition to hand over the keys to his kingdom. Yeah,
and then you go on this kind of like magical mystery tour of the Oasis with Parzival. I keep calling him Percival because it sounds so much like Percival, who was the guy who went after the Holy Grail.
Parzival, yeah. Had you ever heard of Parzival? There must be a Parzival in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is my only understanding of the Holy Grail story.
Well, Percival was, I think he is the guy who found the Holy Grail.
Oh, okay. Is he? All right. I thought Parzival, they'd taken it directly from it. Is Percival maybe just the sort of modernised English translation of a more traditional name, Parzival?
Quite possibly.
I did clock that Artemis has a line of dialogue where she says, "Oh, Parzival," as in the knight who went after the Holy Grail. And I really did think like if you've got to explain the reference, then get rid of the fucking reference. In a film that is 100% wall-to-wall references to other stuff, you can't be explaining some of them. There's a big problem there if you have to have a line of dialogue explaining it.
But I think because it's part of the book, they couldn't really change the main character's name, could they?
Fair point, fine. Yeah, but then I'm criticising the book as well as the film.
Yeah, it has polarised people, both of these, like the film and the book. But also like this obsession with pop culture and fandom. And it kind of like takes on this, like you mentioned about sort of like, it's like the cult element of it, and cult as a term anyway, it kind of takes on this religious tone as well, because it's like a religion for these people. They are obsessed with all of this 80s and 90s culture. So Wade is constantly looking up all of this stuff. He wants to know what Back to the Future was, and he wants to know this reference and this thing that Halliday used to play, and everything about his life. And there's also the artifacts in the game. So people are on these like crazy quests to get these artifacts as if they're like holy artifacts and things like that. And like, obviously the Holy Grail comparisons and all of this, and like, it could be like holy relics. And it gives it that kind of like, it's this weird view of fandom and pop culture as a religion. What did you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. But it's also a certain type of story where our religious characters are living in a world that is just in the wake of their Messiah figure's death. So it's not like a modern Christianity allegory that the Messiah has. The Messiah is in living memory for all of these characters. They all remember Halliday. He only died a few years ago. I think he died 5 years before the events of the film. So you were living in a world with your Jesus, and you remember Jesus, and now Jesus has died, and you're in this kind of first wave of religious fanaticism. So they're kind of also the architects of the religion in that way, because that's how religions are formed, I guess. I mean, that's how Christianity was formed. It was all the stories, and then the evolution of those stories over the couple of thousand years to get us to where we are now. These characters are the building blocks of a possible religion around Halliday, I think.
Yeah, and it's that obsession that everybody has over Halliday and what he created, because it rules their lives. They're always in the Oasis. They're always spending their time and money there. And the fact that the quest itself is based around the stories that are told about him, his past. They've got this shrine, this museum of Halliday, which shows you all of his memories and all of the things he used to play and watch and everything that he loved. It gives you that kind of like shrine kind of element as well.
Yeah, it's like a temple. It's a temple within the game to Halliday. But he created it himself, didn't he? He's kind of memorialized himself and built his own... he's edited his own testament, his own Bible, because he's been into those archives and removed every other reference to Karen. So he's kind of... He's got some self-awareness over his own story, hasn't he? But taking away those religious allegories, and just looking at the kind of the future world that it presents, that's like a dystopia in the real world, and then they all live in this utopic pop culture VR. I did think that there was a missed opportunity to have the VR be another element of the dystopia, because the world is so terrible that they have to disappear off into VR, but the VR has no culture of its own. It's just reconstituted from the remnants of mid-20th to early 21st century pop culture, and then culture stopped at Halliday, and Halliday's thoughts on culture and the culture that he liked became the only existing culture, it seems. There's nothing to the culture in the world of Ready Player One. It's just all a reconstituted mess.
Yeah, I think that is a real shame, isn't it? But I suppose it doesn't work in the ideas of the film, like being about those references that you can get when you're reading it or watching it. But it's very interesting that there's no other art being made. There's no other films or creations or other pop culture references that they can have. There's nothing like that, because everyone is just reliving the 90s.
Exactly. There's a missed opportunity for exploring how bleak that actually would be in practice. There's a moment where Sorrento is trying to win Wade over, and he promises him that he will convert all the schools on some planet. I assume it's some VR planet. Convert them all into the schools from Ferris Bueller and the Breakfast Club. And Wade is like, "That's so cool." And I was like, "That's not cool. That's incredibly bleak. That your best outcome is to replace schools with references to John Hughes movies. That's really bleak." But Wade sees it as like, "Yeah, that would be cool, actually." Yeah, I mean, it's all a trick from Sorrento, so we don't really, they don't really get into that. But Wade is clearly in favour of the idea of schools being from John Hughes movies. It's just strange, and they just don't explore that. They do get, in the end, it is about you shouldn't spend so much time in VR, but they don't get into how bleak the actual pop culture coma is that the world is in.
They really gloss over that factor, don't they? I feel like there's a lot of things like that they don't properly develop. But one of the things they do look at quite a bit is the characters' identities in the game, and this kind of like idea of like there's kind of a catfishing element. So Artemis and Parzival have this kind of like relationship which is supposed to be blossoming into like a loving relationship, but that's mainly because Parzival is obsessed with Artemis, and there's stuff which doesn't quite work there. Like Artemis kind of rejects Parzival's advances in the VR world because she's like, you don't know me, you don't know who I am. And H, who turns out to be a woman as well, she's saying like he could be like, Artemis could be a really fat guy in his mum's basement playing VR. You don't know these people outside of this world and this sort of construct they've got around themselves. So what did you think about that, and sort of like the way their identities worked and how they explored that?
I was slightly annoyed by the fact that H turned out to be a woman in the real world, and only because it was just so painfully obvious that it was going to happen, because H is like the only character that talks with a distorted, lowered voice. And you could tell it's Lena Waithe as well, because like I've seen her in other stuff. I don't think I have, but I could tell it was a woman's voice that was being pitched down to sound like a man's voice. And just as soon as H came on screen and started talking, you're like, well, that's, there's going to be some sort of revelation about H not being who he presents as in the Oasis. So it's a little bit frustrating. Same thing actually with the curator, who was very recognisably played by Simon Pegg, and we've seen Simon Pegg on screen as another character. It was that stuff really annoyed me, because I think like to get into that in a more interesting way, you have to like let the reveal kind of happen. And I just cast another actor, just have a different actor play the curator's voice and H's voice, and then let there be a reveal about the way they're, presenting their characters in the VR world, and they've got control over that, and they can completely become someone else. I just thought that was it. And I watched this before eXistenZ, but now that, thinking about how interesting that they use voices in the VR world of eXistenZ, and then Cronenberg's doing something really interesting with that, to just sort of lazily, not really mask Simon Pegg and Lena Waithe's voices, I don't know, just annoyed me. Just didn't think they did enough with that.
What's up, H?
Hey, what up, Z?
Next race is in 20 minutes and I can't do the late one. What the hell are you up to?
Man, getting my kills on, bro.
Is that Daito?
Daito and Show.
She's the big mystery.
No, a bet is a bet.
Oh, wow. A quarter. You can keep it.
No, you can keep it.
Also, I feel like this idea of sort of like identities in the real world and in the game is such an interesting concept to look at. And things like gender pronouns and stuff like that, you could have like, if you were doing this now, you could have a bit more of an exploration into that, and sort of like, how does H identify her or himself?
Well, if you say if they were doing this now, this is now, James. This was only 3 years ago, less than 3 years ago. This is a very recent film, and you're right. They could have done that in the film, and perhaps it's not there in the book because the book came out 10 years ago now, where maybe those conversations weren't happening so much. But those opportunities were definitely there to get into that, and it doesn't.
Yeah, I think there's so much they're trying to pack into this as well. Like they're trying to do 100 different things in the story, and then because they're doing that and packing it full of all of these pop culture references, you can't really get at a really in-depth storyline that you can get attached to, because we know Spielberg can do that. Most of his films are sort of exploring the kind of like the family element and sort of how families work. So things like E.T., War of the Worlds, they're all like focused on families and how they interact with each other. And this film is supposed to be like, you've got all of these characters who are separate, but they kind of build a family together. But I feel like that didn't really come across in this. By the end, they're kind of like, it's still all Parzival's doing. It's his game to win. He brings his mates along, but it's not kind of this camaraderie, this feeling of belonging that I feel like should have been there.
Yeah, the character journey for Wade is basically, he says several times that he doesn't join clans, and then he stops saying that he doesn't join clans and he joins a clan. That's basically the character arc that he goes on. I agree with you. Just to come back to the identities thing though as well, like you mentioned the catfishing element, and that Artemis kind of kicks off at him and like rejects his advances. I don't think Parzival was totally out of line to fall for Artemis, because she's making the point that like, oh, you only see what I want you to see, you only know what I want you to know. Well, that's true of anybody dating someone, meeting someone as a potential romantic interest. You put on your best behavior kind of thing, right? When you're meeting someone, and this is a world where everyone hangs out in VR. So surely a lot of relationships would start between two avatars. Wade's best friend is H, and he's never met H in real life. Like that's a real relationship that they have. So I didn't think Parzival was out of line to develop feelings for someone that he only knows in the Oasis.
Yeah, it's kind of that weird conflict of interest that the film's got though, because like by the end of it, it's saying, okay, you shouldn't spend too much time in virtual reality, but most of the film is telling you virtual reality is the place where you build up all your relationships and you can see people for who they really want to be.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So it's kind of like, it's this weird disconnect there, because Helen really wants to be that character in this world. So that is her persona, or his persona. Whereas Artemis wants to be like that as well. And like all of these things just don't quite mesh as well as they could, because again, it's just packing in so much pop reference.
Again, it comes down to what you said about it not being a kind of fully explored exploration of like identity and presenting one's identity in the way that you choose to. I think conflict of interest is the right term. Yeah, it's like they're trying to have their cake and eat it with the narrative and the themes.
Yeah, and like there's this whole thing about Parzival having this unhealthy relationship with the virtual world as well, to a degree, because he is so obsessed with it. Like he spends all of his time in this world, and he's like we said, he's built up all these relationships with people and things like that, but his whole life is revolving around that. So he hasn't got a job per se. He's not really helping his aunt out from the looks of it, in sort of like paying for rent or sort of helping them out. There's no sort of like real world jeopardy there until the corporation start coming after him. And then even when the corporation come after him, they kill his aunt and he just doesn't really care. He kind of like he's sad for like one moment, gloss over it.
Well, I think the very next scene, he's trying to kiss Samantha on a rooftop. Literally the next scene after the tower block's been exploded. It's the same. It's kind of the same problem as the family narrative arc he goes on. It's like you were saying, like they're kind of coming after him. There's no real jeopardy, and then very suddenly his aunt gets blown up. Like everything just sort of, there's no build up. That the arcs are just not very good. There's no gentle moves to the narrative, because, well, I mean, like you said, they're packing a lot in. It's really more about moving us from one fantastical VR action sequence to another, really, isn't it?
Yeah, so maybe we should talk about that for a bit then. Let's talk about the set pieces. What set pieces did you really enjoy? Were there any which didn't quite work for you? What did you think about that? Because like the majority of the film is doing blockbuster CGI effects and creating this virtual world. And I would say all of the production design and the way it looks is really great. It creates this world and it's believable when you get sort of sucked in. I really enjoyed all of that, negating some of the plot problems and things like that. But what did you think about those set pieces then?
I don't know. I mean, the set pieces were where I got bored, to be honest. I wasn't...
Okay, so you didn't enjoy.
Yeah, no, I wasn't particularly interested in them. Like, I remember thinking, during the massive battle scene at the end, I remember thinking how much it looked like Avengers Endgame, but it hadn't earned the sort of narrative status of the battle in Avengers Endgame. It felt like a very sort of surface layer version. of the end game. And the end game, the way it functions in the end game is very similar. It's basically just a lot of references on screen. It's there so that fans of the Marvel series can be like, oh, there's Black Panther, there's the Wakandans, there's Doctor Strange. Yeah, that's cool.
Oh, there's Harley Quinn in this. There's like,
There's 3 Master Chiefs. I love Master Chief. There's 3 of him.
Yeah. There's that guy from, Overwatch as well. But one of the ones which I thought was a bit weird was the Iron Giant. And I read about this afterwards. And the Iron Giant is only there because in the book, it's supposed to be Ultraman, which I think would have worked so much better. And I was waiting for Ultraman to pop in. But they used the Iron Giant because obviously Warner own the rights to the Iron Giant. So it's an easy fix. You could just throw in a different kind of like big robot or whatever.
Yeah, I did wonder, this film must have been an absolute nightmare for the lawyers. Nightmare / dream come true, because the billing of the lawyers' time to get this stuff made. But who's Ultraman then?
Ultraman is he's like a Japanese sci-fi character. He kind of fights all these kaijus and things like that. It's like a really big franchise. There's been loads of Ultramen. Like, I love it. Ultraman is absolutely brilliant.
Oh, is it similar to what's Power Rangers based on? The Japanese show that they use the footage from?
Super Sentai. Yeah, it's sort of like a similar kind of thing.
Okay, cool.
But then also they've got the Gundam robot in here as well, and I felt that more sort of like fit with it.
So you can get the rights to Gundam, but you can't get the rights to Ultraman.
Yeah, apparently so.
Yeah. A lot of it was lost on me. I think, maybe it's just because I'm not so into that. Yeah, you're right, though. The Iron Giant stands out a little bit because, absolutely amazing film. I absolutely love The Iron Giant. But, I don't know, not like a stalwart of pop culture, is it? It's not like one of the most culturally memorable films ever made, I don't think.
But also the Iron Giant is very sort of anti-gun and anti-everything. Yeah, they're just like, he's using all these lasers to kill a bunch of people in this world.
H just sort of slaps on the Iron Giant outfit as a big battle mecha suit without... And again, that's another problem with the film, though, isn't it? It's sort of this surface layer of pop culture that doesn't really appreciate and understand any of it. It's just enjoying the reference of it. And that's something that, again, isn't fully explored in the film. That could have been a really interesting point, that these characters don't... like H instantly recognises Kaneda's bike from Akira, but does H give a shit about what Akira is about? Or is H just like, cool, a bike, I get it. Which I think is exactly what H is doing, but they don't really get into what that kind of means for this culture that they live in. That people just don't give a shit about what any of these references mean. Wade does, because he's obsessed with Halliday, but I don't know.
Yeah, and the film is so much about sort of exploring Halliday's relationships and like his past and why he did the things he did and the regrets that he has. And these all lead Wade and his team to finding out where the keys are and finally where the Easter egg is. But there's still this kind of like weird creative thing. Like one of the moments which I thought was really like interesting and a bit weird was the whole Shining set piece. Like when they go into the Shining and then it's like clearly the same sets and they've got that moment in the bathtub and all of this kind of stuff, but they do it in this kind of like weird, funny way, and then suddenly it turns into like this zombie film, and I don't know how I felt about that.
Yeah, no, I get what you mean. It's like Scooby-Doo in the Shining mansion. Very strange, doesn't suit the tone of the movie, or maybe it does because it's so strange and a very surface layer sort of appreciation of the Shining, so maybe it's appropriate for them to do that. But I found that whole sequence very strange. Again, it's like, why The Shining for this scene? It's like, yes, it's a sort of a monument of pop culture, but it doesn't fit in with the character who drives a DeLorean time machine. Very strange, very jarring.
It's weird, but it's kind of like, I still kind of enjoyed it a bit, like seeing the Shining stuff, but then when it takes on that weird video game quality, I mean, you've got like such a great film, The Shining, but with all of these weird characters coming into the world, I don't know, maybe they could have gone to Back to the Future, like film world or something, and then made something with that. I don't know what they do in the book.
I think that would have been more appropriate. Yeah, going into a family-friendly action movie is what Spielberg should be doing. It's like, I don't know why. What is the kind of culture that Spielberg is trying to celebrate here? I get that Spielberg would be a massive Kubrick fan, and a lot of this will be determined by the plot of the book as well, obviously. But is that the kind of thing that they're trying to celebrate here? And I don't know, it just doesn't fit with everything about Halliday. And yeah, Back to the Future I think would have been a better choice. Star Wars, to be honest, slightly lighter films that have a lighter subject matter. I'm not trying to do Back to the Future and Star Wars down, but they don't have the depth of The Shining. So it's quite insulting to The Shining to just throw your characters in and turn it into Scooby-Doo a little bit like they do in this film. It's not reverential.
And they make that whole sort of like reference about how Stephen King didn't really like Kubrick's The Shining, and that's why they go there. But they could have done a right around for that, I feel like. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't quite fit the tone of the film.
I've never seen The Shining. Is it really scary?
I have to watch it through my fingers.
Yeah, it's all very strange. Do you know what we didn't actually talk about though, James? We haven't even actually talked about the VR tech itself. We talked about the VR world, Oasis. We talked a lot about Oasis. But what did you think about the technology that the characters are using in the real world to interact with the VR, and how that's set up when Wade goes into the van for the first time at the start of the film?
I thought it was really interesting. So they've got like a omnidirectional treadmill, which I thought was quite a cool idea. So that's how he's running around the world when he's just stuck in a van in the middle of a junkyard. And his VR suit kind of evolves as well, doesn't it? Obviously, he's got the hand, the gloves, and he's got the headset at the start. But then later on, he's got a suit where you can feel stuff as well. And it does all of these sort of like things to make him feel like he's being touched and stuff like that, which is kind of the VR technology people are working on at the moment. So it's not too far from what we're aiming for. So it kind of seemed quite believable what they were using.
Yeah, believable in you mean in the terms of realistic to like possible technology that could exist. Yeah, I agree. I thought it all looked pretty cool. There was some silly stuff in there, like why would they design the suits to hurt your balls so much that you think you've really been kicked in the balls? Like, I was a bit like, oh, maybe I wouldn't buy a suit that could kick me in the balls. But that's fine. It's just a gag. It's fine. But what I found really interesting was, even though it looked really cool and it was a really good design for VR kit, I think it's a really good film to compare with eXistenZ, because it made me realise that something that I've been noticing all through this series we've been doing is that VR headsets like Ready Player One seem more realistic and believable, but VR worlds created in other ways like eXistenZ and Strange Days that take over your consciousness seems like it would be more believable for the characters. I could never get sold on the idea that Wade really completely feels like he's, about to kiss Artemis, and having a really intimate moment, because the edges of his vision, his peripheral vision, would show the inside of his van. You would never escape that with a headset kind of setup. And even Oculus Rift and stuff like that, you're never going to lose the sort of the feeling of the air, the smells, all of that stuff that keeps you grounded in a janky old van in a junkyard. But a disgusting, horrifying umbilical cord that wraps around your spine and takes over your brain, I do believe that would create a very convincing VR world somehow, in a way I don't understand. It's not realistic, but I'm more sold on these VRs that take over your whole consciousness in some way that's not very realistic.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because they don't smell anything in this world, and that's one of the main ways that a lot of people experience their sense of reality and things. Yeah, and he kind of he can disconnect from the headset, and he does a few times when he's in sort of like mid whatever he's doing in the Oasis. He pops it off and goes, "Oh, what's happening over here?"
Yeah.
And all of this kind of stuff. Yeah, it's a very interesting sort of topic, isn't it?
I think that's the lesson I've been learning this series, that I prefer the VR films where it's much more complex and sci-fi ridiculous than just a headset. I think that's what I prefer in a VR film, because I think you can do more with that story. And it's interesting that Halliday's reflection on you've got to live in the real world. His sort of bottom line point that he makes is that like it's the only place you can get a good meal. But then,
that's it. That's the only reason.
But he's right. He's talking about like something like really key and important and biological about living in the real world and appreciating it. But then immediately I was thinking about Sci-Fi in The Matrix, who knows the steak is not real, but he doesn't care because it tastes real. Sci-Fi can get a good meal in VR. Halliday's saying that you can't. It's because it's a different type of technology. In The Matrix, in eXistenZ, in Strange Days, in Brainstorm, it's a completely different thing to the VR headsets that we're seeing in a lot of the other films. I just think you could do a bit more if you get beyond the headset in Sci-Fi.
You don't need a destination when you're running on an omnidirectional treadmill with quadraphonic pressure-sensitive underlay. James Halliday saw the future, and then he built it. He gave us a place to go.
And the fact that so much of Halliday's life was filled with regrets, like splitting from his partner, Ogden, like played by Simon Pegg, like not carrying on that relationship, and sort of missed opportunities in love potentially and all this kind of stuff. And the fact that he was so invested in this virtual world, and it almost feels like he doesn't want Wade to have that so much, which is kind of why at the end they go, we've got to keep the Oasis closed on Tuesdays and Thursdays so that everyone can have a day off in the real world. Just like weird stuff like that, which the film hasn't really led enough to.
Yeah, truly bad. We shut it down on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It was so sudden. The film actually ends quite suddenly on that point. And coming back to the idea of like having your cake and eating it with the narrative and the themes, it basically ends on it's okay to completely live your life in VR, carry on, enjoy all the pop culture references, but just remember to take a break. We're going to enforce breaks. That's how they kind of resolve the tension between living true to your inner identity and accepting the reality of the world. They just say you got to take a break on a Tuesday and Thursday.
That's all you got to do.
I really thought when that happened, I couldn't help but think like, well, that's very easy for Wade and Samantha to say as they get off with each other in their beautiful new penthouse. But millions of people are still living in the stacks, and their only escape from that is playing tennis or pole dancing in Oasis. And what, you're just going to force them to sit in their shitty little caravans on Tuesdays and Thursdays while you make out with each other? Come on.
Well, there's a Ready Player 2 now. And they're working on the film adaptation as well. So maybe they'll try and sort that out, because this film did really well. Like it got loads of money in the box office. And like, obviously it's a Spielberg film. It's a blockbuster. It's like got all of those action elements. It doesn't quite work with the plot, like we've said. Like there's lots of elements there. And if you're not into all sort of like the pop culture references, you'll miss something there. But I mean, despite all of this, I still had quite a fun time watching it, I've got to say. Like, I don't know what it was. Maybe it's because the sort of like the geek in me was noticing all these little characters and things like that, and I was just along for the ride. But it's only when I've been talking about it since I've sort of made myself realistically look at all the flaws that are in this film. But I mean, it's still enjoyable.
Yeah, I slagged it off a lot, but I basically think it's an okay/decent film. And for me, that comes down to the stuff that we talked about at the start of this bit, where, Spielberg is just incredibly competent. He does make an entertaining, compelling, family-friendly adventure movie. I found the action sequences a bit dull, but, there was a good pace in the film. It hits all the right, like, beats at the right times. I just thought it was fairly, like, surface layer. That was my main problem with all of it. But you're right, it's a good little adventure film. I'll probably watch Ready Player 2. I don't think they're going to get into the more interesting societal stuff. I doubt it. I don't know. I could be wrong. I don't know if people have read the book and maybe it does do all that stuff, but I've got my doubts.
And also they do this whole thing where they say, "What are you, Halliday?" when he meets his like AI, whatever it is, in the Oasis. There's something there as well. Like, is there some sort of afterlife in the Oasis, what's happening there. They don't really explore that kind of idea.
What was his actual answer?
He didn't really answer, did he? He just sort of walked off with his younger self. Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just about. Yeah, I'm sure he did. I believe you.
People need to spend more time in the real world. Because, like Halliday said, reality is the only thing that's real.
Yeah, definitely feels like a bit of a missed opportunity with that film. But I mean, I like we said, it's still enjoyable. I liked all the sort of ideas, and it's very interesting to look at in our virtual reality series because it was such a big blockbuster looking at VR. So next week on the show, we'll be exploring the world of anime once again. I am very excited to be introducing you to these anime bits and pieces next week, Matt. So we're going to be taking a look at a number of things, but the main focus will be a series called Sword Art Online. And we're also going to be taking a look at another film from Mamoru Hosoda, Summer Wars from 2009. So yeah, it's going to be a anime special.
I'm a complete blank slate here because, you know, I'm fairly ignorant when it comes to anime. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm interested and excited.
Yeah, there's lots of anime which kind of explore virtual reality and these kind of things. There's been lots of series recently, so hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion about what they're doing in those series. And yeah, a more detailed deep dive on a couple of these other things.
So join us next time for that. In the meantime, if you're looking for more Journey Through Sci-Fi content and you want to support the show, you can head over to patreon.com/Journey Through Sci-Fi and sign up there to check out our bonus episodes.
And if you want to get in touch with us, we are all over social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We've got a website. If you look up @Through Sci-Fi or @Through Sci-Fi Pod, you'll be able to find those. So yeah, come and have a chat.
And of course, another way to support the show is just to leave a nice review for us. We always appreciate your kind reviews. So leave us a review, and in your review, let us know what your Oasis username would be. I'd love to see that.
Oh, interesting. Well, that's about it for this week. We'll see you next time.